All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Network 2020's discussion. We are honored today to welcome three top-notch panelists to Network 2020 to continue what seems to be almost a series of conversations about infrastructure. And today we're going to look at competition for strategic infrastructure. We conceived of this idea based on President Trump's remarks about Greenland, the Panama Canal, and Canada. And assuming that there is more than just bluster to his thinking, we were curious to learn about some of the through lines, which seems to be about access to the infrastructure of today's and tomorrow's economy and economic power. Before I introduce our guests, a few words about Network 2020. We are a New York City-based nonprofit that provides a platform for nuanced discussions about global affairs. We bring leading thinkers and doers in the global affairs space to our audiences, both in person and online. And I would say that our audience members are all leaders in their own right and really strive to be informed citizens. So I commend everyone for taking the time to participate in these discussions. It is a pleasure today to welcome first Dr. Mary Bridges. Mary is a historian of the 20th century US who explores the linkages between US foreign relations and business history. She is the author of Dollars and Dominion, US Bankers in the Making of a Superpower, which was published last September. We are also pleased to welcome Dr. Evan Ellis, who is a research professor of Latin American Studies at the U.S. Army War College Strategic Studies Institute, where he focuses on Latin America's relations with China and other non-Western Hemisphere actors. He has published 5 books, including the 2022 China Engages Latin America, Distorting Development and Democracy, ? He was previously on the Secretary of State's policy planning staff for Latin America and the Caribbean. And lastly, we are pleased to welcome Jonathan Hillman. He is Senior Fellow for Geoeconomics at the Council on Foreign Relations, where he explores economic and security issues, including investment, trade, infrastructure, and technology. He is the author of Digital Silk Road, China's Quest to Wire the World and Win the Future. He has served as a senior advisor to 3 US cabinet officials as well. So welcome to the 3 of you. Mary, I would like to start off with you, my favorite place, which is let's lay some groundwork. Could you briefly, if you can, I realize you're a historian, so there's a lot of material to work with. Could you outline the historical quest for infrastructure dominance and how it has shaped global power dynamics? And also, just to make sure we are all on the same page in terms of what we are talking about, what do we mean when we talk about infrastructure?
So a few centuries of history and definitional ground rules. No problem. I'll take the second piece first, just to make sure we're all talking about the same thing. And I think infrastructure is one of those words. I think if you ask 4 people, you might get 4 different definitions. To me, it means the complex networks that deliver critical public goods and services. So like clean water, energy, communications, those sorts of things. There's some squishiness or some opacity to the boundaries of infrastructure, which I think is part of what has made it a really useful and politically powerful tool. And that kind of power is actually part of the history of the word. Infrastructure began as a term among French engineers in the late 19th century, and it didn't mean the tracks of the train. It meant the earthworks below. It was like the culverts and the bridges and the embankments that enabled smooth transit of the railway. And so it's really the stuff beneath the stuff. And it was an obscure, technical word for a long time until the Cold War. The start of the Cold War, it has a real military context. There were debates about how to rebuild Europe and to prepare against communism. And French negotiators used the term infrastructure to mean not just the bases, but the stuff that made the bases work, like the radio towers and the landing strips and the highways. And so that term, there's no good term in English, even though U.S. negotiators hated how foreign and pretentious it sounded. It was useful. And all of a sudden, by the 50s, it starts being used in English to describe organized crime networks or school systems. And so that kind of porousness of it really is what makes the term become incredibly powerful. So that's the like recent history of the term. The states have used infrastructure, whether called by that term or not, as a way of projecting power for centuries. So just think about Roman Empire and aqueducts, British and their ships, and US and transcontinental railroads. And I think so in some ways you can see US-China competition today as continuation of that age-old story. One of the features that I think we'll talk about is that there are some distinctive features to the way modern networks interact that makes today's geopolitical competition rather distinctive and worth paying attention on its own terms, in terms of the ways that you don't just talk about power delivery, or it's electrical systems coupled with global supply chains and communications networks, and all of those technological systems come together and reinforce each other such that the way these networks operate, and I think it's one of those things where at a certain point a difference in size becomes a difference in kind, which has features that I imagine we will continue to untangle in the course of our conversation today.
Right, great. Thank you for laying that out. John, turning to you, from a geopolitical perspective, how are countries like China and the US approaching infrastructure control today? And how would you kind of compare and contrast that approach?
Yeah, so I'm struck by how China is in many ways following in the footsteps of the great powers that came before it, but also that the infrastructure game has changed in some important ways. So China's flagship initiative, the Belt and Road Initiative, was announced in 2013. This is basically Xi Jinping's signature foreign policy vision. And it includes much more than infrastructure, but I think the infrastructure piece is central to it. It's really the carrot for getting a lot of countries to participate in this initiative. It's the spoils for often large Chinese state-owned enterprises. And in many cases, it's kind of the source of the greatest fear about, what exactly is going on here with this global set of activities. And I think what's striking is not just that China is going out and this vision on its face does sort of look imperial if you look at some of the maps with these sweeping corridors, crossing across continents. But even on a project level, there are some interesting parallels. And so, for example, in Kenya, China has built a rail project literally right alongside a line that was originally built by Imperial Britain. In Southeast Asia, China is arguably following in Japan's footsteps. And in other cases, China's following in the footsteps of the United States. So one of my favorite examples is a port project in Pakistan at Gwadar Port, which at one point in time was the landing site for a British telegraph cable, but then later on was the potential. It almost became a U.S. project, and so the Pakistani government pitched it to the United States. And this is when Henry Kissinger was National Security Advisor. The National Security Council did an assessment of this and said, we think that this is probably not a commercially viable project. It's likely to upset many people in the region, and it's more sort of about catering to some domestic interests. Many of those things still, I think, are true today, but China went ahead and did the project and now has a major stake in Pakistan, that being one of several large projects it's pursuing. So there's lots of parallels, but then the game, I think, has changed in some important ways. In many respects, I think it's more difficult to be an outside power pursuing these large projects in countries, just given that international law and international norms have evolved so much. And so there's much more scrutiny of these projects. And even things that we take for granted, like the fact that you and I have, cameras on our cell phones, leads to more scrutiny of sort of what's going on the ground. As a result, I think the battle for control these days is a little bit less absolute and a little less permanent. And so it's really maybe even more about influence. And so I kind of think of the game as being maybe more multifaceted even now than it was. And so you've got opportunities to advance your interests if you're a large power building projects at many stages, right? As a financier of projects, as a designer or builder, as an operator. And so there's this sort of range of avenues at which, you know, all of these stages matter to some degree, but it's less about sort of pure ownership and absolute control over these areas. And so to that extent, I think it's actually become a much more interesting competition.
Just to follow up on that briefly, I mean, it's interesting that you refer to this project in Pakistan that China took on, but Kissinger declined. You know, what you wrote a book on Belt and Road, excuse me. What do you think that larger objective is? Is it, you know, are these projects that are critical for China? Is it, you know, a means of tying influence? What do you see as the larger objective behind it?
Yeah, I think there's several important incentives. You know, one thing that I didn't mention is that even though China's Belt and Road Initiative has existed now since 2013, there's still no official definition for what qualifies as a project, right? And so even that is sort of an interesting relinquishing of some degree of control. But it's also quite smart in other respects because it allows many different competing interest groups to take whatever they're doing and say, you know what, this is part of the Belt and Road. I need government support to help me go pursue this objective. And so, you know, I think it does often depend on the project, but a project like Gwadar in Pakistan, there's a set of commercial interests, you know, the large Chinese state-owned enterprises that have built so much domestically that they've essentially run out of things to build in some cases. This is good business for them. And they don't, you know, to some extent, it doesn't really matter if the project is viable. And then you've got another set of interests that are more on the strategic side of the spectrum, for whom, you know, the PLA and others, for whom access to this part of the world and to have a, you know, potential facility in that location is valuable and may be worth paying for.
Thank you for that clarification. Evan, turning to you, zooming in on a particular case, Panama Canal. How does that illustrate the broader competition between the US and China for strategic influence in Latin America?
It illustrates it in many different ways. First of all, it's symbolic to recall that the giving of the concession to Hutchison to the Panama Canal back in 1999 was one of the first major post-war, post-Cold War items of attention to China's presence and the debate about it in the region. But it also illustrates the way in which these questions of strategic infrastructure have both peacetime and wartime meetings. And so, of course, with the peacetime meaning, important to recognize that within our hemisphere, Panama is a global logistics and finance hub. And so a lot of the Trump administration focus on the unacceptability of the idea that you would have influence among the Panamanian government and the families there. And indeed, the question of whether the neutrality treaty signed in 1997 has been breached by that influence illustrates that. But more broadly, also, when we look at the wartime issues, it's, of course, useful to recall that the whole issue of the unacceptability of the closure of the canal, that goes back to the very 1977 treaty itself and the question of setting up exercises like Panamax to rehearse the defense of the canal, and of course, Secretary of Defense Higgs' visit to the region looking at that. But it illustrates the breadth in a number of different ways. So first of all, when you look at the attention to the Hutchison port operations in Cristobal and Balboa, the broader Blackrock deal, which would have acquired Hutchison ports if it goes through, it actually involves not just those two ports, but it's a reminder that it also involves other strategic ports around the region, such as, for example, a number of ports in Mexico, a number of ports in the Bahamas, and even in Argentina, and of course in other parts of the world as well. But also the question of the way in which the possible closure of the Panama Canal and why that is militarily significant to strategic infrastructure takes us to a whole network of other critical Chinese infrastructure and questions. And so, for example, in time of war, you would have different U.S. facilities for sustainment and deployment of forces, flowing forces that would go through the Caribbean. And so noticing that there are a number of different Chinese port projects and tourism projects and other infrastructure that would give the Chinese access to that and thus the opportunities to disrupt those flows. Of course, the opportunity to disrupt flows through the Panama Canal, which would be critical to the defense of Taiwan. But then when you look around elsewhere, for example, recognizing that if the Panama Canal itself was interrupted in that transit, that the alternative for U.S. warships would likely be going through the Straits of Magellan or possibly the Drake Passage. And there again, the question of Chinese commercial logistics facilities that received a lot of attention. Literally, the head of U.S. Southern Command, Admiral Halsey, was just there, calling attention to that. And then, of course, more broadly, if things went badly, you look at the other side of the continent and the Chinese, the COSCO-operated port of Chiang-Kai, which could be used potentially in time of war to be able to receive and perhaps resupply PRC warships operating in the Caribbean. And then that doesn't even get us to the issue of space. And so you really see the way in which this one infrastructure item from a warfighting standpoint is tied to a range of other different commercial activities, but that have strategic significance. And then just to end, also worth reminding that when we talk about transportation infrastructure, and of course Belt and Road often emphasizes that, but of course you have the digital Silk Road, among other things. And so it's a reminder that the infrastructure, even in Panama, but also elsewhere around the world, when we look at what China is doing, it also involves the question of their dominance of electricity infrastructure, of digital infrastructure, and not solely limited to telecommunications. It involves questions of financial infrastructure, even, all of which are useful points of leverage in peacetime, but also useful opportunities for disruption or espionage in wartime.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for that and for making that distinction between peace and wartime. Mary, going back to you, we've talked a lot about this, I think, almost from a government perspective and, in particular what China's doing, but there are obviously a lot of actors in this space, including powerful private actors. And so what kind of relationship would you like to see between powerful private infrastructure companies and political leaders? And how might a realignment between those groups impact infrastructure, governance, resilience, and global influence?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And I think this has come up a little bit in both of the previous answers of the involvement of private sector entities in infrastructure. And I'm going to go historical on this one too. And I think infrastructure inherently involves some kind of mashup of public and private sector operators and power. That's an age-old story. East India Company, dating back centuries, Rockefeller, Standard Oil, the operators of critical systems. In many ways, governments play a central role in kind of creating the space for private sector operation and management, licensing, structuring deals, risk, that kind of thing. And then you need contractors, engineers, maintenance firms to kind of allow those systems to work. And I guess, so originally I'm a historian of U.S. banking overseas, and so in the United States, this really came to the fore when this stuff becomes really clear when systems break. So like the Panic of 1907, the United States financial system is on the brink of meltdown, and it takes one person who's sort of the overlord of financial infrastructure, J.P. Morgan, convincing a bunch of bankers to restore trust in the U.S. financial system. And it was very, very clear the power of a single private sector entity over how much control that person had over critical infrastructure, such that it mobilized a political alternative, the creation of the Federal Reserve System, as a way to not cede that much power to a private individual. So I think we can see some of that. I mean, BlackRock is an example of a financial entity to me that operates with some of the same scope and reach and kind of infrastructural power. Its assets under management are so vast. Its assets under management are greater than the combined GDPs of Germany and Japan, which just blows my mind. Not only that, it just came up in Evan's response. It's a port operator. It's building infrastructure. It recently acquired one of the largest infrastructure firms in the world, and it designs the algorithms that other banks use to assess risk. So it's like got hands in all kinds of infrastructure activities. So to me, it's not just about private sector entities controlling the levers of power. It's how that power actually moves through these networks is really decentralized and mediated by other forms of infrastructure, increasingly controlled by algorithms. And I think all of that layering creates really significant problems for democratic governance, for transparency. And I wish I had silver bullet solutions to it. But one of the things that seems really striking is that we very often don't pay attention to the democratic implications, the political implications until systems break. It takes a natural disaster or a cyber strike or some other kind of crisis for us to realize that we have a real serious governance problem on our hands.
Quick follow-up. Knowing that there's no silver bullet solution, is there any particular area that you're worried about a breakdown in when you're looking across the spectrum?
I mean, there are lots of there. I mean, I focus on financial systems a lot. So I mean, to me, the systems of the dollar moving around the world they're just I don't really have the vocabulary to describe all of the ways in which that system is changing so dramatically. But the conventional ways of dollar supremacy no longer seem to be exactly, I mean, this is not an argument that I still believe that the dollar's centrality is going to remain central, but like, in terms of stable coins, decentralized finance, the way in which those systems operate really have profound implications for who can squeeze, who controls the bottlenecks, and who is best protected when things fall apart. So that and given how many other infrastructure systems run through that financial system, that's a core one on my mind.
Thank you. Speaking of unintended consequences, Evan, do you see any unintended strategic consequences to the United States' approach to infrastructure control, particularly in Latin America?
I do. I see many, and of course, I'm talking strictly in my academic capacity and not in my capacity as a government civilian. But I would say first, it depends on whether you assume that the way something is done in a strategically sound in terms of the consequences or not, and also which part of the current U.S. pushback towards China do we consider that pushback against infrastructure? So I would emphasize just very quickly what I see is five groups of consequences, and then just three quick comments. Number one is that to the degree to which we do things that are what I would call strategically meaningless, it gives us the sense that we've taken care of the problem, and in many ways it actually increases the risk. And so, for example, we mentioned before that the Belt and Road Initiative membership really has no clear, legal binding authority. And so the first thing that the Molino government in Panama did when they were trying to assuage the concerns of the Trump administration is they announced they're getting out of Belt and Road. Well, that sounds like a victory, but it actually has not gotten us in legal or material terms anything. Or, for example, a number of our partners have deferred different PRC projects. For example, the BYD plant in Mexico, the Sheinbaum administration has deferred that, and yet that deferral really, again, has not, increased, the U.S. strategic position. The second area is the degree to which, when we do things like demand things of our partner that go against a treaty that we ourselves have signed. In this case, the Panama Neutrality Treaty and the Carter-Torrijos Treaty. That causes partners to question our reliability in entering into other agreements. Now, this not only undercuts our ability to be a competitor and actually contract with partners, but at the same time, it also takes away an advantage that we have heretofore had over the PRC in that, generally Chinese companies are understood as legally somewhat predatory. So a lot of very onerous contracts that you have to watch the fine print for. And so the degree to which we undermined our perceived advantage of being a reliable, safe partner, that hurts us in the competitive space. The third area is that partners, of course, even if silently seek to diversify away to other options. Now, that might be not just be China, but it could be to the European Union, et cetera, but that decreases U.S. leverage. And then, of course, fourth, to a certain degree, we do not get everything just from being transactional, to the degree to which we are undercutting the goodwill that our partners have, in the sense that we are on the side of democracy and the relationship is important for non-material reasons. what happens is that when we go to ask, well, please don't go with the Huawei network, or even though we don't have something else to offer you, please don't do the security cooperation. We undercut our partners' willingness to do that for us just because they value the relationship. And then, of course, to the extent to which we actually can provoke political change. And so we have put the Molino government in a very difficult position in Panama, in the degree to which we undercut friends and get something worse. Again, strategically, that can undercut our position. And I'll just very quickly make three other brief notes. Number one, currently a lot of our pushback in the port sector has really been pretty ineffective. And so, the Hutchison deal, as we've seen with Blackrock, actually because of Chinese leverage with the antitrust investigation, may actually be off. Some of the talk about trying to keep the Chinese out of places like Shanghai and the port in Tierra del Fuego have not really had an impact. In the telecom sector, as we've seen, we really haven't had much of a counter offer to be able to put something up there against Huawei's advance, and the degree to which we are undermining our ability to work with other neighbors and partners who have something, such as Ericsson or Nokia. Indirectly, we are taking ourselves farther out of that space. And then finally, financial. The degree to which we, as occurred during the first Trump administration, are using sanctions and even secondary sanctions. There is an indirect cost of the overuse of those financial sanctions, in that, in terms of financial infrastructure, if we are moving the world away from a world that relies on the dollar, we are actually taking away over time our own tools for limiting the danger, or taking away some of our leverage over those partners.
A lot of unintended consequences. Thank you for outlining them so concisely. Just to a note to all of those who are listening, pretty soon I'll be switching over to audience Q&A. So if you have a question, please feel free to put it in the Q&A box, and I will try to get to as many as possible. John, turning back to you, kind of big picture, looking ahead, and Evan and Mary, I'd also welcome your thoughts on this. How should the U.S. prioritize its global infrastructure strategy across areas like critical minerals, the Arctic, and even digital, to remain competitive with, not China, but not just China, but remaining competitive and also resilient in the face of any geopolitical setbacks?
So I'm a fan of play to our strengths, right? And so I think the U.S. has several advantages. Let me just maybe mention a few of them. I think the first is private capital. And so this is just very different, structurally different approach than how China has, in the past 2 decades supported its infrastructure projects, right? So, the U.S. does have some public money. We've got a U.S. Development Finance Corporation. We used to have a little more foreign aid, but they're not on the scale of, China's main lending vehicles, right? And so, but the U.S. does have a very large and deep capital market. And so there are opportunities using, those vast pools of often savings, insurance money, pension funds, retirement savings, et cetera, to use that money to make investments in projects that are commercially viable, right? I think that is the key distinction, right? They need to be commercially viable. There's opportunities to use public money to de-risk projects and to take projects that are sort of borderline viable and to attract that private money. But to me, that's sort of play the long game, preference projects that are commercially viable over those that are not. There are, of course, exceptions to that rule, right? The U.S. may have a strategic interest in a project, and it may be willing to pay, to make it happen, regardless of the sort of commercial dynamic of it. In some respects, even though the Blackrock consortium port deal is a little bit in limbo, it is quite interesting because, at least to my knowledge, does not involve $1 of U.S. government support. It's got lots of other government involvement from the outside, perhaps, lots of rhetorical involvement, but financially, this is a really commercially oriented deal, and so I think that is sort of playing the longer game, an area where the U.S. should go. Another advantage is technology. I think even though the U.S. did fall behind on 5G wireless networks, we still have many strengths in the digital arena. And so I would just call out a couple of them. We have got, the world's largest hyperscalers who are investing massive amounts of money, not only domestically, but internationally in data centers, subsea cables. We've got the best companies in the world in many areas of satellite communications and a real head start in low Earth orbit broadband constellations. And so those are first mover advantages that we should press. And there's a lot to offer there. There's a lot of attraction to those offerings from foreign partners. And then maybe the last advantage to mention here is just the network of partners and allies that the US has. China has lots of labels that it likes to put out for elevating certain relationships it has. But dressing those up is not the same as the depth of the alliances that the US has. And several of those close partners are real players in the infrastructure game. So Japan, for instance, still very active in Southeast Asia. Australia, very active in the Pacific Islands. Of course, the EU has its own set of capabilities as well. And I do think that there's been some progress in recent years to try to coordinate those efforts. There's a lot going on now that will distract from that, of course, but there are some pretty notable examples of cooperation, both at sort of a macro level and on an individual project level. Of course, more room for improvement as well. But I would just note those as three advantages: the private capital, technology piece, and then the network of partners and allies. I think that all needs to be part of whatever the US vision is here going forward.
Great, thank you. Two follow-up thoughts to that. One is regarding the subsea cables and the satellite constellations that you mentioned. The previous infrastructure conversation that I mentioned, we did, and if Brian could pop it in the chat, I think that would be great. And because we looked specifically at those areas. But I'm also curious to get your thoughts, and maybe Mary and Evan can chime in too, because Evan had mentioned earlier this idea that there hadn't been alternatives to Huawei, and in the US, as you mentioned, it's a very different system in terms of these private capital markets that are looking for commercially viable projects. And so what are the advantages and disadvantages that you see, John, in this within the current geopolitical realm with these different systems, where China might be showing up in places for non-commercially viable projects where you would have private capital markets in the US that would be like, I'm not going to touch that. How do you see that playing out in terms of, even if it's, soft?
Yeah, I think that China's approach, this is true on the digital infrastructure side, as well as some of the other, transport and energy projects. But I think that there's a advantage in terms of speed, to be able to move fast. There's often a cost advantage, which is, I think, to me, that is the biggest factor that often sways foreign decision makers. Is if you can come in with a 30% cost under whatever your actual cost is, that's often quite compelling. There's been an ability to sort of offer a full package. So not just the project itself, but the financing for the project. Got the company that's going to deliver it. We'll provide training to people. We'll even operate it for you if you can't operate it. And a willingness to spend time and attention. This is especially true on the digital infrastructure side, in markets that are quite niche, right? And that may not be getting as much attention from very large commercial players. One of the dynamics here is that as Huawei and other Chinese providers have basically been squeezed out of many of the world's advanced economies, in order to grow, they basically have to double down in these emerging markets. So they are incentivized to spend more time there, to give them more attention. That is their path to growth, to survival in some cases. And so I think the U.S. still does have, again, it sort of depends on the system, the type of infrastructure we're talking about, but in the digital space does have a lot to offer. And I think the sort of the winning argument is often less about who trusts whom and who, it's less about security. It's more about cost and who's going to deliver the benefits that they say they're going to deliver.
Thank you. Yes, Evan.
Yeah, first of all, thoroughly agree with many of John's points. And for me, just to add a couple of the recommendations. First, just to pile on to what John said about partnerships. Oftentimes, it's not just about the technology, but yeah, being willing to work with Ericsson or Nokia or others if there's not a US solution in the space, but also in terms of the financing of infrastructure, probably the working with the Japanese on the Trans-Pacific Cable Partnership is a great example of that. And so being attentive to the ways in which moving away from partnership in other areas in our foreign policy engagement undermines our ability to be competitive in these collaborative solutions. But also, I think important to be holistic. And so there's a real issue right now, for example, with lithium processing, among other things, where even though we have a certain access to lithium, we're losing our processing capability. And so you have to be attentive to the entire value chain as the Chinese often are. Also being attentive to standards. This is an area where, especially with companies such as Huawei, and especially as we move into AI, the ability to lock up those standards and lock in disadvantage is something we have to be very attentive with the Chinese. Another thing that particularly worries me, that again, an unintended consequence of our tariff policies, is the degree to which we're on the one hand trying to encourage investment in infrastructure by friendly nations as a competitor to the Chinese, but at the same time we're trying to say, okay, we're going to create these big tariff walls so that you invest in the United States and not abroad. We are indirectly undercutting our very ability to be able to compete in infrastructure out there through things like the Development Finance Corporation. And then finally, with respect to space, one of the things that is an area that's worried me that we don't talk about enough, although for example, Elon Musk with Starlink and things like that, we do have a lead. Chinese constellations are even more ambitious than those. I mean, things like Thousand Sails with Space Sail and others. And so that's an area I think where we particularly have to worry about, Chinese taking away advantages that we currently have and then leaving us at a disadvantage in a strategic area.
Great, thank you for that. So just turning to audience Q&A now. And again, if you're listening and you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box and I will get to as many as I can. So Mary, this first one is for you. And the questioner asks, when you mention financial system disruptions, are you referring to SWIFT in particular, and are sanctions intensifying this?
SWIFT is a great example of one of those sanctions and kind of the peculiar ways in which infrastructure power operates that I think Evan also referenced, that there are indirect costs to using sanctions. Being in control of the dollar doesn't necessarily mean you get to wield that power however you want. And I think one of the things that the emphasis on partners is really important here, because these systems are so sprawling and so completely complex that it really takes having allies and to keep that dominance of infrastructure in place. So SWIFT is a great example of that, and I think that I think it really brings to the fore some of these peculiar aspects of infrastructure power.
Thank you. Evan, we're getting a few questions on Latin America, so I might try to bundle them a little bit. So we have one questioner who's asking that they stay at a recent conference in Brazil on infrastructure financing. It was clear that Brazil is now looking to China as opposed to the US for support. This was particularly true because of China's interest in Brazil's strategic minerals. Is this an irrevocable switch of allegiance? And I think you generally answered this one about whether US disengagement or protectionist policies could unintentionally open the door for deeper Chinese partnerships in the Western Hemisphere. So we'll start with those ones and let's circle back from.
No, absolutely. And very happy to talk about Brazil. And I think probably the key thing with Brazil is, especially with large economically pluralistic states such as Brazil, it's not one versus the other. The Chinese Brazil has gotten about 40% of Chinese financing. The Chinese are in a number of different major ports. I mean, they're in internal rail structure, oftentimes competing with existing infrastructure of Brazil's own companies like Vale, for example, with the mining. There are questions of infrastructure in the soy frontier. What I see is that the way in which the space continues to be open is that because despite the leftist orientation, particularly in the second rendition of Lula's government, that makes him more disposed to working with the Chinese. Brazil has still kept itself open as a market viable ally. So it has access to capital markets. U.S. and other firms can be competitive, and yet at the same time we have to be attentive to the way in which the Chinese can use use their relative advantage at scale, especially, for example, tying into something like the port of Shanghai, which if you want to build something to Shanghai operated by Costco, then, China Railway Road or another, gets the leg up if they're going to build up, that train that would go connect Mato Grosso to that. And so one of the other areas where I think there's more of a problem is the smaller countries, especially those countries that put themselves in a populist direction. Rafael Correa with the infrastructure, with hydroelectric and others during his time in Ecuador, and others certainly, the Ortegas now in Nicaragua. The danger oftentimes is when populist countries close themselves off to Western capital markets, that essentially locks them into China, and of course they're politically deposed to turn to China. So I think it's those countries where we have to be particularly careful, and in others where there's kind of a elite capture taking place, or if we essentially by our own sanctions behavior actually push companies into the hands. I was particularly worried about some remarks that were made towards Colombia, saying, well, if Colombia turns to China, well, then that's great news for the U.S. buying Ecuadorian coffee and fruit. Well, the exact risk is that if we respond by threats, we essentially lock in the advantage China has in capturing certain elites and infrastructure projects, which have negative effects with us reinforcing that disadvantage going down the road.
Great, thank you. Sean, turning to you, we have a question here, and they write, how does Elon Musk's control over dual-use infrastructure like SpaceX and Starlink complicate the narrative around who controls critical infrastructure? Want to take a shot at that one?
Well, Mary will know this better than I do, but to me, it's a little bit of I guess, a return to the past. That we've got these individuals who, in the private sector who have, significant control or influence over large pieces of infrastructure. So, you could recall in the U.S., you could recall railway systems and the sort of tycoons that were involved in those. You could, in the case of Imperial Britain, recall some of the companies that owned, the World Telegraph networks. And so, in one sense, it's not totally entirely new dynamic. On the other hand, it is new technology, right? And I think there are questions there about, the provision of public goods and how can the government work with the private sector to make sure that U.S. interests are fully reflected in those systems.
Thank you. Mary, would you like to add anything there?
Oh, I think that was great. Yeah, same but different. Yeah, I think exactly like how those networks operate, the connection of between social media and satellite connectivity, like the networks that might fall under Elon Musk's kind of purview might be different than what we've seen from railroad tycoons of the past, but it does raise some of those same questions of accountability, of access, the politics of distribution, and governance.
Well, oh yes, Evan.
Just one more, especially on Elon Musk, and that I think we're in this weird place right now where the personal, the political, and the strategic are all having interactions with each other. And so, for example, with respect to Elon Musk got in a tiff, of course, over X in Brazil with the Lula government, with Alexandre de Moraes. And so, the Brazilians wanted to turn in accelerated fashion to the Chinese, who are offering, again, their alternative to Starlink. In some ways, that accelerates that. We're in another situation where in another part of the world, I mean, we're traditionally used to having those advantages of infrastructure in areas like space, and yet, for example, the threats implicitly, for example, to shut off Ukraine's access to Starlink from minerals deal, that indirectly increases the attractivity of a Chinese offering over Elon Musk's offering in a lot of other places in the world that see that vulnerability in that but apply it in their own. And so we're in a world of unprecedented interactions between personal agendas, political agendas, rivalries, and the way in which each of these things affects the other.
See, one of the big things I'm getting is that everything is so much more integrated, and that trust and reliability are almost more important than ever, it seems.
Absolutely.
Mary, question for you, and a historical one. How did the U.S. dislodge Britain's sterling dominance, and do we see any parallels today vis-a-vis Sino-American competition?
Well, I think in a few ways, and I think there's no simple answer to this. But obviously, a major disruption was World War I, and the way in which the United States, the World War I, really jostled Britain's centrality to global trade, and the role of British banks shifted, and the kind of peacetime wartime context that Evan brought up, it really matters in how day-to-day business was conducted. I studied the history of U.S. banking overseas, and the way in which U.S. bankers were actually operating overseas well before that. They were just doing it poorly. And in fact, almost all US banking overseas was this project to try to do what the British were doing and desperately playing catch up. And it didn't matter so much that they were bad bankers in the early 1900s. They were there after World War I, when all of a sudden there was this huge hunger for dollars. So the infrastructure wasn't great, but it was there when people needed it. So it was it's this combination of kind of geopolitical tumult and infrastructural distribution, and of course the gigantic power, manufacturing power, the productive power of the United States that was able to kind of fuel that churn for dollars overseas. So I see it as a really entangled story. Economic historians have been much more precise about when exactly that transition happened and why it was sustained. But to me, that kind of entangled confluence of infrastructural power was absolutely central to it. And I think what we're seeing today, like the reason this whole conversation has traction right now, is that we're seeing some of these kind of anchor pieces of U.S. global power of the 20th century kind of come into question right now. And so I think some of the things that we're talking about of China's port construction and all of these questions that are on people's minds again are back, because not only are the ways that the world is being wired being changed from the digital revolution to green energy, the actual technologies themselves are changing at the same time when the powers themselves are competing about how the wires get laid, basically.
Thank you. John, turning to you, there's a long intro to this question, and the questioner is going to want your thoughts. So they write, Mr. Hillman rightly highlights U.S. comparative strengths in private capital, technology, and alliances. However, recent developments suggest that these advantages may be eroding. President Trump's tariff policies have introduced significant uncertainties, deterring long-term investments and straining relationships with key allies like Canada, Mexico, the EU, and Japan. These actions have disrupted supply chains and increased costs for infrastructure projects. And additionally, tariffs on tech components have impacted U.S. tech firms' global competitiveness. Such policies risk undermining the advantages that you so well outlined. So what are your thoughts? How do we retain that advantage? How do we keep that moving forward?
So I was hoping to not use the word tariff during this hour, but if we need to, then I will. I think it's a good question. Obviously none of this is happening in a vacuum. That is the issue that is driving most of the US's economic interactions with foreign partners right now. I mean, we've got over 50 countries that received higher than 10% reciprocal tariffs, and they're all in a sort of, in various stages of negotiating with the U.S. government. And so it's a very valid point to ask, how is the U.S. going to be making progress on the infrastructure front while all attention is, sucked up into the tariff discussion? So totally valid question. Look, I think it depends a little bit on, your theory about how this gets resolved. Maybe there are also, during these interactions, these bilateral discussions, maybe there are opportunities to address or begin addressing issues that have impacted the delivery or provision of infrastructure. There's also been, I think, the U.S. has been very interested in encouraging partners to make certain investments. For example, an LNG project in Alaska seems to come up in conversations with Japan and South Korea. And so in a way, even though it's focused on tariffs, you could see the advancement of some individual projects that are deemed important enough. But look, obviously, I think that this needs to get to a place where it's a little bit more sustainable, and expectations about where things are going are a little bit more, there's a little bit more confidence, right? I mean, we're never going to have certainty, but a little bit less uncertainty would be nice. And that could maybe create some room to continue making progress on some of these infrastructure issues. Because again, I do think through the G7 and other fora, there had been quite a bit of progress made among the US and its partners.
Great, thank you. Evan, turning to you, we have a question about China and Latin America again. So your forte. And they ask, is China using infrastructure investments in Latin America to build soft power and long-term economic leverage? So what do you think China's end goals are there? And if I may add on to that question, how is that being received by some of the countries that you've been studying?
No, absolutely. So for me, China is using infrastructure in a variety of different ways, but not often in the ways that we think. First of all, for me, as China builds expectation of benefits, people dream of access to Chinese markets. People dream of being the partner for a local Chinese firm when they build a big infrastructure project, because their company locally knows the president's brother-in-law's company, et cetera, et cetera. And so oftentimes it's that expectation of benefit that gets that impacts how people talk about China, how people assess risks, what governments are willing to do. In that context, as the Chinese use their leverage to secure infrastructure, as we've talked about here, infrastructure builds relationships. And so, again, it's the Africa model. If you operate the mine, if you build the road, if you own the port, it goes in your direction. And so the construction of infrastructure inherently gives you leverage on top of the construction of a benefit. To use the peacetime example of the port of Chiang Kai, for example, the fact beyond the wartime use of Chiang Kai, the fact that there's an attempt to make Chiang Kai into a much lower volume, a lower cost port, that much like anybody who's flown through Atlanta and trying not to use Delta Airlines know, Chiang Kai's control over that not only gives them the up over the other members of the other global shipping alliances, but it also gives COSCO a potential ability to build up access to other ports. And so, for example, in Pasorja in Ecuador, in Buenaventura, there are now new offerings, but you have to go through COSCO if you want to get into to Chiang Kai. And so that actually impacts the offerings that governments have. Or if it's your electricity infrastructure, or if it's your telecommunications infrastructure, that gives you the leg up in building on top of that. So at the end of the day, it's not that China is in the Han Bantota Sri Lanka example, trying to squeeze somebody with debt trap diplomacy. It's rarely that coercive, although it occasionally is. But oftentimes it's something that's much more subtle, that you structure the relationships. Indeed, it's ironic that people like Emanuel Wallerstein and Raul Prebisch, back in the days of writing about dependency in Latin America, used to talk exactly about how these financial relationships, infrastructure relationships, privileged the question of who captures the value added and who do you work with. And so China is structuring the relationship in our own, essentially near abroad, I think, in ways that should give us, who is mostly, most impacted by these things, pause and great concern.
Oh, that conversation makes me want to almost play a very modern version of Settlers of Catan, because I think we could definitely do a good updated version. We have a few more great questions that I hope we can try to get to. And again, I'll direct them at one of you, but please feel free to jump in. John, how are emerging technologies like AI and quantum transforming infrastructure control, and how is this influencing the US and China's strategies?
So I think AI in particular is really on sort of near the top of the list for many foreign leaders, right, as they're thinking about what they want access to. And so it needs to be part of the package now, right? And so in order to be competitive, it almost has to be part of the package, at least in the digital infrastructure space. And with that, as we were talking about before, not just providing the software, but this is a piece of the overall bundle. This is another feature, right, that sort of goes along with the hard infrastructure, the data center. It goes along with maybe the training that's being provided. I think there are also implications on the U.S. side, and this is in the news recently, about export controls around semiconductors. A lot of the world would like access to the best semiconductors that the U.S. has, and so there's still an ongoing debate within the U.S. government about where exactly to draw the line and who should have access to what. Quantum, I personally view as maybe a little bit too early to be kind of part of that commercial offer. But you could imagine interest in types of scientific exchange and collaborative research that could be, again, part of the package for engaging with partners. But it's a great question because infrastructure continues to change. And I think to be competitive, you have to be incorporating these newer elements.
Thank you. And Mary, I'm going to direct this next question to you and try to put a historical spin on it, even though it's sort of forward-looking. As infrastructure becomes increasingly digital, what risks arise when tech failures like the CrowdStrike outage cascade across sectors that were never meant to be so interconnected? And is there, in your mind, any historical precedent that we can turn to for lessons?
I don't have a really good historical precedent for that kind of digital outage, but I guess to me, there seems to be a policy imperative that accompanies that kind of digitization. And that's just anticipate failure, plan for failure. The layers of dependency and kind of infrastructural embeddedness that accompany the just how deeply digital infrastructure permeates so many of these other networks really seems like no single entity can insulate itself from failure. And so the ability of a major institution to adapt quickly, to pivot, I think that's the fundamental changes in the way those networks operate create different imperatives in terms of policy responsiveness. And so that nimbleness and planning for failure seems to become even more important. I don't have a great historical analog to that, but that's what comes to my mind.
Well, it's hard to come up with a historical analog to something that's so digital, but that interconnectedness, I guess it's, are we at this unique point in history where we're dealing with something totally new? Just one really quick, I'll pose this question to all of you. It was directed to you, Mary, but I'd be curious to get all of your take on it in, a minute or so. And I'll start with you, Evan. Are there any lessons from this fascinating discussion that can help us think more creatively about providing more incentives to global infrastructure development today?
No, absolutely. I think you have to think holistically, and we have to think in terms of the relationships that we have with our partners. This is not something that the U.S. can go alone, and we do so at grave strategic advantage. We have to think with respect also to technology, not only as it is now, but how the evolution of technology, as Mary so well said, will impact what is important down the road. And at the end of the day, also, I think it comes to do not just with the technology solution or putting the money in, but it has to do with shaping institutions, to push for transparency, to push for our partners to evaluate the rules of the game, to essentially deny more predatory aspects of Chinese infrastructure advantages, to make sure that if not U.S., at least more reliable Western control over infrastructure occurs, because that at the end of the day, and not just U.S. infrastructure control, is what, if not a world that the U.S. dominates, it's certainly a world in which the U.S. can safely operate in all types of infrastructure.
Thank you. John, your thoughts? Any incentives to global infrastructure development?
Yeah, so I think I sort of think in terms of the sort of economic incentives, and I think there are at least three developments that'll happen in the next year, sort of policy developments that are worth watching from the U.S. The first of them is the reauthorization of the U.S. Development Finance Corporation, right? So this is the successor to the Overseas Private Investment Corporation. Has a larger balance sheet. It's got the ability to use equity, but it's got a lot of room for improvement too. And in order to be able to take the types of risks and do the types of deals that its designers intended it to be able to do, but that has the potential to do a lot more. And so and I think there is bipartisan support one of the few issues these days, but there is bipartisan support there, I think, for renewing and potentially upgrading the DFC. The U.S. Export-Import Bank is also up for another look on a little bit longer timeline. And then we've also got, I think this is more sort of on the U.S. domestic front, but there could be changes made to how the U.S. looks at attracting foreign investment. So yesterday was actually, I think, the 50th anniversary of the committee that screens foreign investment that comes into the U.S. CFIUS. The new administration is thinking about how to make a sort of fast track for foreign investment. And so I think that's another area to watch that could, again, sort of on the domestic front, result in more money and potentially more infrastructure.
And your thoughts?
My last, okay.
Yeah. You get the last word in 30 seconds.
I think the cautionary tale is that we forget about infrastructure once we build it. Once it's done, there's a lot of attention at the outset, and then we never hear about undersea cables until they break, right? So, but I think these systems are not self-maintaining at all. They require decision-making, resources, maintenance, all kinds of stuff all the time. And building in measures for transparency, accountability, making sure we have partners involved. I think we don't just cede control once they get built. To continue maintaining those government, that kind of oversight and accountability is really, that's incumbent on us not only in the design, but ongoing operation.
Yes, thank you. Yes, I always say, in addition to triumphing innovation, I think we also need to take a good look at maintenance. So thank you all. This was fascinating. Really appreciate it. Thank you everyone for listening. Just really, really quickly, we do have an event for our members only tonight. It is on US and Vietnam, and in particular, Vietnam's role I guess in the midst of this big tariff debate. So that is for members only, but you're welcome to join as a member. It's virtual. It's with the wonderful Professor Eddie Molesky. So please join us. It is not too late. And we do have some upcoming events next week that's free and open to all on the U.S. Sovereign Wealth Fund. So we'll be taking a deep look at that. And I think that that might be all we have to announce. Yes, you can RSVP, and also we're a nonprofit. So please, we encourage everyone to donate. It keeps us going. Thank you to the three of you. Really appreciate it. It was a great conversation, and have a wonderful day, everybody.